So when someone is, one of the hardest things to do with someone else is to sit in silence in their presence. And actually, it's awkward to sit in silence. One of the signs of discomfort is that a person makes noise, they clear their throat, they say something. Many of the things that people say, it's not really because they had what to say. It's because they just can't bear to be in silence. And the reason they can't bear to be in silence is because they're not comfortable with themselves or with the person that they're with. And maybe you could say the reason they're not comfortable with the person they're with is because they're really not comfortable with themselves. The deepest sign of intimacy and trust is the ability to remain silent next to the person you're with. And the same could also be said for our service of God. If a person has to broadcast their faith and announce it, and if a person's faith activities make a lot of noise, that might be a sign that they're not entirely comfortable with it. They're constantly in negotiation with it. The same is true, by the way, vice versa. Recently, a celebrity in Israel, Aviv Geffen, came, he made a very stark break from his previous practice and he's made, a very concerted effort to make connections with and friendships with and show support for the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredi community in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. For me, this came, for many people, this came as a big surprise because Aviv Geffen modeled himself after David Bowie. Okay. And I have to say that David Bowie, like Aviv Geffen, don't get me wrong, I respect him as an artist. I think he's a really sensitive soul and really authentic and committed to authenticity. I mean, some people say it's an act, but they said the same thing about David Bowie. When he was younger, he did, he dabbled in cross-dressing a little bit and that kind of thing. He wore makeup, he really kind of took on that David Bowie type persona. And he also spoke very harshly about his atheism and his disdain for religious people. So for many people, this came as a surprise that Aviv Geffen is, cozying up from people to religious people now. But to me, it didn't come as a surprise at all, because anytime you heard Aviv Geffen speak, he was always, consistently talking about how he doesn't believe in God and how he doesn't like religious people. And it was just, I heard in this constant declaration that he's in a sense of, he's constantly arguing with it. And that God is a very big presence in his life that he's constantly negating, that he has to constantly disprove and struggle against. And so here is a person whose atheism was so noisy that I questioned it. But the same again is said for somebody's religiosity, that the noise is a sign that it's, somebody who goes to a fancy restaurant And you hear them from the other side of the room. Oh my God, this steak is so good. And they're slurping and they're chewing, and you can hear them chewing the steak from across the room. And oh, and the sauce and this and that. You know that this is not a person that is accustomed to eating in such places. The person who can't think of eating any other way walks in and eats quietly, and you wouldn't even know it. So, praying with noise is a sign of maybe an immature faith. It's not well integrated. Now, am I saying that one should not pray with noise? Absolutely not. And this is perhaps the lesson of this week's reading, which is that the noise is a stage that's necessary to be included in the garments of the high priest. When he enters into the holy, that needs to be there too. Because if you will only demand excellence, if you will only demand advanced performance, then you have death. Because everyone who runs must first crawl. And so a person has to know where they are and has to be true to who they are. And if that's who I am, and if that's what I'm up to, noisy service, because I'm figuring it out and I'm arguing with it and I'm pushing against it and I'm navigating it and negotiating it. And it's not something that I'm really integrated with yet. Then I need to be doing that. You have to do that noisy work in order to reach that integrated silence, and for us to require the high priest's garments to reflect only the advanced is a big problem. It's kind of like, I heard once about a young man who had a very hard time finding a match, someone to marry. And he dated many girls, and he couldn't commit to anyone. And he was being raised by his grandparents. And after a while, his grandma said, you've gone out with so many girls. What's wrong? How come you can't seem to find one that you want to make a relationship with? So he said, Grandma, when I see the way you and Grandpa look at each other and the way you treat each other, none of these girls that I'm going out with do I feel that I have that level of comfort and that I have that level of, I don't see that. And so it doesn't seem like I could have a relationship with any of them, because the relationship that I know is the relationship that you and Grandpa have. So what would you say to such a young man? The noise comes first, right? That kind of silence is bred. That kind of silence comes after 50 years of marriage. Okay, you want to, then you can't expect to have that in the beginning of a relationship. In the beginning of the relationship, you're going to have the awkwardness of silence, and you're going to have the need to explain yourself and defend yourself and clarify and argue, and all of those kinds of awkward and disintegrated, not integrated behaviors and dynamics are important. And you will never get to the 50 years of marriage if you don't first start with Pamon Zahav V'Rimon, Pamon Zahav V'Rimon, a pomegranate and a golden bell, a pomegranate and a golden bell. As the high priest enters into the holy, which implies, it suggests the beginning of his entry, when he first steps in, that should be his approach. And pomegranates are complicated fruits. Open one up and you know what I mean. So those of us who feel that we don't yet have a real integrated, we're not solid and settled, that's okay. You're on the high priest's garments too. Make some noise.